August 27, 1776. New York, New York. The American War for Independence is at long last underway. The siege of Boston had lasted for nearly a year, as American and British forces, under their tactful generals, endeavored for control of the peninsular city. Ultimately, the British, unable to move beyond the city by land and cut off from supplies except as delivered by British ships which were constantly under varying degrees of harassment from American vessels, retreated from the Jewel of Massachusetts, sailing north to the friendly shores of Nova Scotia on St. Patrick's Day, March 17, 1776. A seminal moment that is still celebrated by the heavily Irish city today. After the withdrawal of British forces to the north, General George Washington, Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, marched his troops south to New York City to the southern tip of the fast-developing island of Manhattan. The natural geography of New York City presented a multitude of opportunities for the Royal Navy, and Washington anticipated the British would value the vast harbor and waterways surrounding the city. Washington ascertained that if the British controlled the Hudson River, they could bifurcate the northern and southern colonies, and with innumerable loyalists populating the Empire State, it could spell disaster for the hopes of the young nation. He stated, "The Tories can only wait for a favorable opportunity to declare themselves openly." General Lee had preceded Washington's arrival in the Big Apple, having spent many sleepless nights trying to solve the tactical intricacies of the strategic Rubik's Cube that was New York's many waterways, harbors, islands, and land formations. He was so overwrought with anxiety and worry, as well as afflicted with an incapacitating case of gout, that Lee would be carried into the city on a stretcher. From there, he ordered artillery installations to be made at Governor's Island, Brooklyn's Red Hook, and Jersey City's Paulus Hook to defend against a British maritime invasion. Lee would profess the difficulties in defending New York to Washington in a letter. "What to do with the city I own puzzles me. It is so encircled with deep navigable water that whoever commands the sea must command the town." Both generals felt the city was indefensible should it be faced with the full might of the British Royal Navy. Yet Washington believed it would be utterly demoralizing to the troops, as well as the citizens, to simply surrender it without a fight. Prior to Washington's arrival in New York City on April 13th, the beleaguered General Lee was reassigned to Charleston, South Carolina, elevating Israel Putnam to Washington's second-in-command. As Washington toiled away in his office, maneuvering regiments, staffing officers, and delineating chains of command, he grew agitated with the administrative duties that kept him from being out in the field. He had stationed 121 cannons by early June upon Manhattan, Jersey Shore, Governor's Island, and Brooklyn, all angled to bombard approaching British vessels. The commander-in-chief also ordered the sinking of hulks into the offshore pathways and waterways the British were most likely to navigate, designed to tear into their holes and make the other ships' approach to the city as undesirable as possible. Additionally, Washington ordered the construction of a series of strategically placed fortifications, namely Fort Washington and Fort Lee, positioned further up the Hudson with a desire to negate the British from creating a maritime passage to Canada upon the river. Fort Putnam, Fort Greene, and Fort Box were all constructed on the eastern side of the East River. These forts were enveloped by large trenches that connected them and brandished together a combined 36 cannons. While these defensive arrangements were being made, the city was gripped with a palpable sense of impending doom. Citizens attempted to go about their lives, but this dark cloud dampened their spirits and consumed their conversations. Adding to the uncertainty were the polarized allegiances of the city's residents, with patriots and Tories living as neighbors, as they all fervently waited for the axe of war to fall upon them. These divided citizens offered up strategic difficulties for Washington. As Washington took strenuous effort to conceal his plans, movements, and strategy from falling into British hands as best he could, a more nefarious plot was revealed when it came to light that local gunsmith Gilbert Forbes had been tasked with paying off turncoats and saboteurs, and that the money for these treasonous acts had been supplied by none other than the mayor of New York, David Matthews. Washington had Mayor Matthews arrested from his Flatbush home at 1 a.m, and, under interrogation, Matthews confessed that Governor Tryon had, quote, put a bundle of paper money into his hands. Over a dozen arrests were made as the city was gripped with rumors that loyalists had attempted to poison Washington's food. The madness neared a fever pitch when a series of reprisals were leveled against the Tories, many of whom were tarred and feathered, others forced to ride the rail, straddling a fence rail carried by citizens, as an angry mob shouted them down, spat upon them, and threw blunt objects at them until they were carried to the edge of town and thrown down onto the hard ground. The fabled summer of 1776 was now underway. On June 29th, Patriot sentries that were stationed upon Staten Island sent word to Washington that 40 British ships had been spotted near Sandy Hook. British General Howe, Washington's antagonist during the siege of Boston, waited for the full brunt of his fleet to advance upon the city, and when the ships first appeared to the New Yorkers, cutting across the majestic blue waters beyond Manhattan, the residents of the town descended into hysteria, bustling about the town to make preparations for the coming onslaught. The moment they had unnervingly expected would not come at once, as they lived for weeks under this sword of Damocles. Howe had under his command an armada of 110 warships and transportation vessels, as well as 5,000 German mercenaries that brought his complete forces beyond 30,000 men. The stage was being set for the largest battle that would take place in all of the American Revolutionary War. While this imposing force cast its ominous shadow upon the city, Howe did not move toward an active aggression at once. Instead, while some regiments of British troops made camp on Staten Island, as well as Gravesend, Long Island, Howe was content to wait until they had every ship available, with the rest of their fleet now being sailed under the command of his brother, Admiral Viscount Howe, across the Atlantic Ocean. Washington had been granted authority by Congress to recruit an army of 28,501 men, but only commanded 19,000 upon his arrival to New York. On top of this, the men were poorly trained, poorly disciplined, and at times poorly equipped. They'd made a habit of firing their muskets in camp. Fights frequently broke out amongst them, and they used their bayonets as though they were crude tools, often damaging them or simply not fashioning them back upon their firearms. The men had been instructed not to trample over the crops of farmers, but not all obliged this request. The most pressing issue was perhaps their frequenting of what was known as the Holy Ground, the infamous red light district where over 500 prostitutes plied their craft after sundown. Venereal infections soon plagued several regiments, diminishing what was already an undersized force. On July 12th, His Majesty's ships Phoenix and Rose sailed into the harbor towards the mouth of the Hudson. They were promptly fired upon from batteries within Fort George and Fort Defiance upon Governor's Island. The following day, Howe attempted to make an alternative approach, sending a diplomatic envoy with a message for Washington. The deliberations never even got off the ground, as the message was addressed to George Washington, Esquire. Refusing to acknowledge the Virginian's military rank, as he could only be officially viewed as a traitor to the crown, Washington's men refused the correspondence. When Howe tried again 3 days later, this time conferring the letter to George Washington, Esquire, etc., etc., as a semantic workaround for their opposing views, again, the letter was denied. With talks of a peaceful transition of the city to British rule now off the table, the looming possibility of battle had now become an inevitability. Washington had not changed his view in regard to his probability of successfully defending New York City, and instead focused on ensuring the victory for the Brits would come at a steep and bloody price. By the middle of August, roughly 25,000 British and German troops now made camp on Staten Island, or dined on dried pork rations upon the more than 400 transport ships in the lower bay. Of Washington's 20,000 men, due to detachments, illness, and infection, he could only muster a force roughly half that size for his impending clash with General Howe. 9,000 men were stationed within the city. 2,400 were garrisoned at Fort Washington, while 1,800 troops guarded King's Bridge at the northern tip of the island, the location of which was selected to defend against a Loyalist attack that may coincide with the British land invasion. Long Island happened to be one of the most poorly defended sites within the city at large. As soon as Greene would train his men on Long Island, Washington would undermine his progress by repositioning these men somewhere else within the city. This prevented the soldiers from formulating a cohesive understanding of the terrain. Just before dawn on the morning of August 22nd, 4,000 troops headed out from Staten Island under the command of Clinton and Cornwallis, making their way to Long Island. Within hours, all of the troops had landed without incident at Gravesend Bay. The Pennsylvania troops stationed there did not engage the British, and instead fell back, slaughtering livestock and torching homesteads along their way. When the sun had reached high noon that day, there were over 15,000 troops ashore, and with them, 40 cannons. They made their camp 6 miles in at Flatbush, as General Howe ordered they press on no further than that. When Washington received news of this landing, he was incorrectly told that the British force that landed numbered roughly 8,000 men. Washington believed this was a feint, designed to draw his forces away from the heart of the city, and he responded by sending just 1,500 additional reinforcements. The American forces on Long Island now numbered roughly 6,000, but the force they were set to oppose had not yet reached its full capacity. The following day, 5,000 German mercenaries joined their British counterparts, bringing the total size of this staunch detachment to over 20,000 men. Israel Putnam had been placed in charge of the American forces on Long Island. He was to command the force from Brooklyn Heights, while Sullivan and Sterling would lead the troops into battle just ahead from Guan Heights. There, the Guan Hills rose up from the ground over 50 meters high, and by stationing his troops here, Washington believed heavy casualties could be inflicted upon the British before the men ultimately withdrew back to Brooklyn Heights. There were 3 main routes that led to the Heights: Gowanus to the west, Flatbush Road to the east, and Bedford Pass beyond that. Sterling held the Gowanus Road with 500 men. Sullivan was to defend both Flatbush and Bedford with a combined force of almost 2,000 men. 6,000 men stood back at Brooklyn Heights as a reserve force and to receive the retreat from their brethren. Jamaica Pass was treated as an afterthought, with just 5 militiamen patrolling the area on horseback. Loyalists had informed British General Clinton of this nearly unguarded path, and plans were made to send a contingent of men on a night march through Jamaica Pass to open a flanking assault upon the Americans that would coincide with the forward assault launched by the mighty force that now occupied eastern Long Island. The night of August 26th, just after 9 p.m., Clinton began his march with a mobile force of infantrymen, and to his rear, Cornwallis brought an imposing detachment of 8 battalions and 14 cannons. Some 10,000 men made the march that night, the column stretching over 2 miles long. Just before midnight, the first shots were unleashed in the Battle of Long Island, as Samuel John Atlee's Pennsylvania regiment fired upon 2 straggling redcoats near the Red Lion Inn. Clinton's movement was part of a devastating 3-pronged attack conjured by the British command to deceive, envelop, and then destroy the Continental Army. Major General James Grant would lead his Highlanders through Gowanus Road in a diversionary assault to the west of Brooklyn. Lieutenant General Leopold Philipp would march the Germans through Flatbush, turning through Brooklyn to arrive at Guana Heights. Howe's men would approach through Bedford towards Brooklyn, where Putnam and his defenses were stationed. This would completely ensnare the Americans stationed at Brooklyn Heights and would repel and expunge the ones stationed in the roads leading there along the way. Washington rode among his troops atop the Brooklyn bluff and commanded to them, "Acquit yourselves like men, like soldiers, for all that is worth living for is at stake." To the south of Gowanus Creek, Lord Sterling led his 1,600 men through grueling combat for 4 hours that morning, while Washington observed through a scope. As the more than 7,000 British and German soldiers overpowered them, their inevitable defeat appeared to be at once coming to pass. Many Americans retreated back down the road towards Brooklyn, and as it appeared that Sullivan would be forced to flee or face his troops being entirely cut down, an unprecedented stand was made by the men of the 1st Maryland Regiment. Under the command of Colonel William Smallwood, they anchored their defenses against the fierce diversionary attack from Grant. In an effort to hold off the advancing enemy's approach to Brooklyn Heights, the men who would come to be known as the Maryland 400 thrust themselves forward in 6 successive catastrophic line charges into the teeth of the British front. The surviving member of the 5th Company recalled the shocking ordeal. The enemy then advanced towards us, upon which General Lord Sterling immediately drew us up in a line and offered them to battle in true English taste. The British Army then advanced within about 300 yards of us and began a very heavy fire from their cannon and mortars, for both the balls and shells flew very fast now and then taking off ahead. Our men stood it amazingly well. Not even one of them showed a disposition to shrink. Our orders were to not fire until the enemy came within 50 yards of us. When the British perceived we stood their fire so coolly and resolutely, they declined to come any nearer, although triple our number. In this situation, we stood from sunrise to 12 o'clock, the enemy firing upon us the chief part of the time. The heroic stand came at a heavy price. While numbers vary, it is estimated that over 250 of the men were cut down, with the survivors being captured and suffering an even worse fate, starved within the sordid underbellies of British prison ships and the waters surrounding New York City. Maryland adopts its Old Line State moniker from the brave undertaking these men gave forth on that late August day. Washington watched the valiant yet horrific stand made by the Maryland 400 and somberly remarked, "Good God, what brave fellows I must this day lose." The British did not want to deliver the decisive follow-up attack over open ground, fearing that they would suffer significant losses as they had under similar circumstances at Bunker Hill, and they began to dig a trench towards the Americans to advance under its cover. Washington would send for every ship, sloop, and seaworthy craft to chart the waters from Manhattan to their location in Brooklyn, and on the night of August 29th, as a handful of American militia kept several dozen campfires alight to give the appearance of a resting army, the Revolutionary soldiers made their escape from Brooklyn Heights to the heart of the city in Manhattan. The operation was blessed with a dense fog that settled into the harbor, concealing the evacuation from the British patrols. As their forward scouts noticed there were no American pickets present, they investigated further, only to discover that the standing American army had vanished from Brooklyn Heights overnight. Just as they were discovering this shocking news, General George Washington was stepping onto the final Brooklyn ferry as the last American to do so. By 7 o'clock on the morning of August 30th, all 9,000 men arrived safely to Manhattan without a single loss of life in the exfiltration mission. Although Washington had decisively lost the Battle of Long Island due to the stout-hearted effort of the Maryland 400 and the surviving men's daring, clandestine retreat across the New York harbor, it was assured that the upstart army of the newly independent United States of America would live to fight another day. And fight they would. But the subsequent battles of the enduring war of attrition for the soul of America are for tonight, other stories for other times. August 29th, 1776, Brooklyn, New York. General George Washington and 9,000 of his men are trapped in Brooklyn. During the Battle of Long Island, just 2 days prior, the American lines were cut through by German Hessian mercenaries and British redcoats, numbering more than 20,000, executing a perfectly staged pincer movement to ensnare the undersized force of less than 10,000 American troops, traveling with columns at night on scarcely guarded roads to attack the Americans on the morning of the 27th from 3 sides. The Continental Army incurred heavy casualties during the battle, but a brave stand by the men of the Maryland 400 that featured them delivering 6 consecutive charges to the lines of the British and their mercenaries would salvage the day, and the war, for General Washington and his young army. The Maryland 400 would suffer over 250 deaths, with the remaining men captured and left to die in the hulls of prisoner ships in New York Harbor. In all, the Americans lost 2,200 men that day, killed, captured, and significantly wounded. With nearly half of the men of the standing army of the American forces trapped in Brooklyn, General Washington had to devise a way to get his men to safety, or the American cause could be lost before it ever truly began. Washington had been outwitted by the British generals. The commander-in-chief held only an elementary-level education. The British commanders, for the most part, held formal educations from prestigious universities and academies, as well as real-world experience in commanding battles on behalf of the Crown all over the world. General Howe, the man with whom Washington would be engaged in this tactical chess match for New York City, was one of the most belligerent generals His Majesty's forces had to offer. While Washington lacked such technical ability, at times making deeply regrettable blunders that would cost the lives of his men and leave the morale of his troops, citizens, and even Congress in a depressed state, he held within himself a constitution and a resolve that was unmatched. It was his temperament to persist onward in the face of overwhelming odds that proved to be his greatest asset. John Adams offered this about the disparity between commanders. He articulated that, in general, our generals have been outgeneraled. Washington would confer with his generals, commanding officers, and elder statesmen. He was a pragmatist of which the highs and lows of war could never fully consume, keeping his eye on the picture at large, foregoing at times his own personal safety or physical limitations to push his men forward. Never was this displayed more openly than in the operation Washington conducted to withdraw his forces from Brooklyn across the East River. The general sent word to Manhattan for every seaworthy boat, vessel, and ferry to make its way to Brooklyn, and as the British dug a series of trenches to launch the fatal attack upon the trapped Americans, unwilling to charge over open ground and suffer large casualties the way the Redcoats had at Bunker Hill, Washington was writing about his men, essentially never leaving the mount of his horse for 48 hours, as he planned, executed, and delivered upon a miraculous exfiltration to Brooklyn. As the advance scouts of the British laid eyes on the empty, smoldering campfires of the field that had just hours before been inhabited by thousands of American soldiers, George Washington was in that same moment the last American to step on a boat, heading safely across the river to Manhattan without a single man lost in the cunning escape. The coup de grace that General Howe had been salivating over for the better part of 2 days, since managing to surround the struggling Americans in Brooklyn, would not come to pass. A dense fog and scattered showers provided the necessary cover for the Americans, concealing their movements from British patrol ships and scouts. The midnight escape from complete disaster was enough to buoy the fading spirits of the Americans for a brief moment, but the reality of the tens of thousands of British Allied troops on the island and the hundreds of the Royal Navy ships that now surrounded New York could not be long avoided. The summer of independence had captured the hearts of the patriotic citizens of New York City as they celebrated the signing of the Declaration of Independence, toppled a statue of King George, and tarred and feathered their loyalist Tory neighbors. Yet this dream of freedom was now turning into an abject nightmare. Upon seeing the condition of the American troops upon their return to Manhattan, word spread through the city of the dire circumstances the colonials were now faced with. The condition of the men was so poor that New York resident Reverend Ewald Shewer would write, "The sight of the scattered people up and down the streets was indeed moving. Many looked sickly, emaciated, cast down, etc. The wet clothes and tents were lying about before the houses and in the streets to dry. In general, everything seemed to be in confusion. Desertions were rampant, numbering between a handful of men to over 100 every day. Militiamen left in droves. Washington knew that New York City was indefensible. With the British Navy controlling every waterway, harbor, and river surrounding the city, there was no way the Americans could stage a sufficient defense of the island. Washington's original goal was to make the British incur a heavy price in casualties for taking the town. However, that now appeared highly unlikely. Once the American general had arrived back in Manhattan, he decided to set up his headquarters in the mansion of Roger Morris, located atop a hillside in Harlem Heights. The beautiful views and comfortable surroundings of the palatial estate were in stark contrast to the inner turmoil the commander-in-chief was experiencing. He would refer to these days in retrospect as some of the most trying in all of his life. George Washington, just 44 years of age at this time, was faced with the most significant challenge he had yet come across in his 4.5 decades on this much-desired continent. After a council of war with his top officers, Washington was neutral on the issue of burning the city of New York to the ground before retreating from it. It was accepted by the council that the Americans would not be able to hold the city. The question was, should they hand the British the comforts of the young, flourishing city's infrastructure, or burn it to the ground before retreating, costing many Americans their homes and businesses in the process? Washington left this decision up to Congress, who ultimately were granted the authority to make the call. Congress voted the city would not be burned, and that it would in all likelihood be taken back by the American forces in due time. Their timeline would end up being a grave miscalculation of the British's ability to entrench themselves within New York. General Howe sent a peace overture to Washington on September 2nd, after he paroled General Sullivan as a prisoner of war. Washington was unmoved, as he would write, "Lord Howe had nothing more to propose than that, if we would submit, His Majesty would consider whether we should be hung or not." The commander-in-chief knew that he was not merely fighting for the independence of his young nation, but for his life, perhaps his family's lives, and for the fertile grounds that had become home to him in Mount Vernon. For all of his superior education in tactics and strategy of battlefield command, General Howe once again stalled before delivering the follow-up attack, this time allowing 2 weeks to transpire between the Battle of Long Island and his next aggressive action. Washington's willingness to listen to peace offerings from the British may have been the reason for this extended pause, as well as the fact that the British were unaware of just how dire the circumstances were for their colonial contemporaries. On September 13th, 4 British warships sailed up the East River. As they did so without a single cannon shot being fired upon them, Washington could only watch and consider what their official plans were. The ships arrived outside Kip's Bay, a small inlet on the eastern shores of Manhattan, and on the morning of the 15th, flatboats left off Long Island and began rowing towards the inlet under the covering fire of a cannonade from the warships. For the next hour, an unrelenting fire rained down upon Kip's Bay from the 5 ships that now surrounded it. A British sailor would write of this, "The ineffective but noisy bombardment shattered the morale of the Green Continentals and Connecticut militiamen at Kip's Bay, even before the landing began." The Connecticut militia was obliterated in shockingly quick order. As their colonel remembered after the battle, "I lay myself upon the right wing, waiting for the boats until Captain Prentice told me, if I meant to save myself, to leave the lines and that the left had given up the lines. I told my men to make the best of their way, as I then found that I had but just 10 of them left with me." Washington had anticipated the British would land farther to the north, and the general learned of the invasion from 4 miles to the north in Harlem because of this when the landing occurred that morning. Washington rode towards the landing and met up with Brigadier General Samuel Holden Parsons and his 1,000 Continental reinforcements along the way. They rode together up Murray Hill. Unbeknownst to them, a vanguard of British grenadiers was ascending the opposite side of the hill. There was a post road with a stone wall bordering it that ran along the crest of Murray Hill that was scarcely defended by the Massachusetts militia. Once Washington realized the British grenadiers were advancing upon them, he ordered Parsons' men to take the walls, as well as line up within the cornfield on the hill. As they struggled to organize the men, militia from the shoreline defenses sprinted up through the cornfield, casting their weapons aside and fleeing in desertion. This was then replicated by the Massachusetts soldiers. The stories of Washington's reaction to the embarrassing and chaotic display have become the stuff of legend. While it's estimated that some of the accounts of what the commander-in-chief did in the aftermath of this are embellished, the basis of all of them surmise that he was colorfully animated and that he snapped his pistols and even caned some of the officers who failed to prevent the desertion from happening. Washington famously threw his hat upon the ground and cried out, "Good God, have I got such troops as those?" The apoplectic general was merely 80 yards from the advancing enemy as this occurred, and had to be physically removed from the battlefield by his aides. As the rout of the Americans continued, British and Hessian troops took great liberties in the conquest of their colonial foes. Over 50 Americans were killed, and another 300 were captured. The invading force even took to bayoneting many of the surrendering men, furthering the insult to their humanity by mutilating their bodies. In one instance, they took to beating a British sailor they mistook for a surrendering militiaman, almost to his death, before a British general intervened. One of the Hessian mercenaries even severed the head of a colonial rebel and stuck it atop a pole rising out from one of the entrenchments. By the afternoon of September 15th, Howe had successfully landed over 13,000 troops on the island of Manhattan through Kip's Bay. The British general had decisively won the battle of the poorly defended bay, and from there took command of Murray Hill, overlooking New York City from the east. Again, General Howe failed to follow up a successful assault with an immediate attack that could have severed the spine of the American forces once and for all. Just a couple of blocks away, most of the American troops had retreated into the streets of Manhattan. Had this exhausted, demoralized, and defeated force been faced with the brunt of Howe's men that day, the tide of the war could have forever been shifted. Instead, because of his hesitation, Waiting for the rest of his men to arrive ashore before advancing, he allowed Washington the opportunity to stage another critical retreat, buying the Americans precious time. Washington ordered General Putnam to evacuate the remaining men as quickly as possible. Putnam ordered the men to abandon their heavy artillery and move north along the Hudson shore, where 3,500 would reach the safety of Harlem Heights. Now, with nearly a quarter of his troops lost, Washington, still fuming over the performance of his men that day, would have to stabilize his forces and make a vital stand against the British at Harlem. There would be little time for them to prepare before General Howe unleashed the fury of the King's men upon the Americans once more in the Battle of Harlem Heights. But for tonight, that crucial battle is another story for another time. September 16th, 1776, Harlem Heights, New York. A fiery General George Washington wrestles with the inner turmoil that has been brought about following successive defeats to the invading British in the Battle of Long Island and the follow-up attack by the British at the landing at Kip's Bay just the day before. Redcoats, accompanied by their Hessian mercenaries, stormed ashore after Crown ships bombarded the defenses at Kip's Bay with a relentless naval cannonade. The result was an abject defeat for the fledgling Americans. As men broke from their lines and retreated, many were killed or forced to quickly surrender. The British took little mercy upon these unfortunate souls who gave up their arms, with the King's men and their Hessian brethren bayoneting, bludgeoning, and even beheading their capitulating foe. Private Joseph Plum Martin, serving with his Connecticut regiment, joined the retreat that day and offered simply that the demons of fear and disorder seemed to take full possession of all and everything that day. For all intents and purposes, it appeared as though the American forces would suffer a crushing defeat that would cut short their quest for independence. As the militiamen and Continentals retreated to the confines of Lower Manhattan, in their squalid and dejected condition, General Howe had the opportunity to advance upon them, trap them on the tip of Lower Manhattan, and drive them into the river with tens of thousands of royal soldiers. General Washington commanded his Major General Israel Putnam to gather the men in Manhattan and retreat north to Harlem, using the eastern side of the island near Hudson River to deliver them from this fatal follow-up attack. He flew on his horse, covered with foam, commanding the men to leave their camps, leaving their cannons and heavy equipment. 3,500 Continentals left Manhattan at 4 in the afternoon and arrived in Harlem by nightfall on the 15th of September. The exhausted, demoralized, and yet still persisting American soldiers made their camp that night at Harlem Heights, often with little but the shirts on their back as they had left their baggage and cargo behind in their hastily made march from the city, their clothes soaking wet from thunderous evening showers that rained down upon the last leg of their journey. Loyalists celebrated as the Americans withdrew from the city, some even exacting revenge upon their patriot neighbors, and raised the Union Jack over the governor's fort, crying out, "God save the King." They then trampled underfoot and burned the Grand Union flag. General Howe, content with the success of the day's land invasion, gathered his men atop Murray Hill to assess the situation and await the rest of his arriving forces coming ashore through the now British-controlled Kip's Bay. Washington had struggled internally with the poor execution of duty of many of his men during the struggle of New York City. This is not to say the Continental Army wasn't replete with individual acts of selfless bravery and units such as the Maryland 400, who sacrificed their lives to the Americans' cause of liberty, but the composition of the American military during this time was one that guaranteed that a constant rotation of green troops would employ the bulk of the rank and file. With most enlistments lasting only 12 months and desertions high, just as Washington had trained his men and they had achieved significant battlefield experience, their tour of duty would come to an end, and thus a new batch of recruits would be brought in, starting the cycle over. Washington had written a wordy composition of these precarious circumstances to Congress on September 8th. The broad letter can be best summarized with this single sentence held within it. On every side, there is a choice of difficulties, and every measure on our part to be formed with some apprehension that all our troops will not do their duty. The Commander-in-Chief would be even more forthcoming about his sentiments during this time in a letter penned to his cousin, Lund Washington, now the caretaker of Mount Vernon. In short, Such is my situation that if I were to wish the bitterest curse to an enemy on this side of the grave, I should put him instead with my feelings. And yet I do not know what plan of conduct to pursue. I see the impossibility of serving with reputation or doing any essential service to the cause by continuing in command. And yet I am told that if I quit the command, inevitable ruin will follow from the distraction that will ensue. In confidence, I tell you that I never was in such an unhappy, divided state since I was born. For all of this internal strife, Washington had endured. He maintained an outward appearance as a dedicated and enduring leader to the men under his command. Uncharacteristically for him, General Howe left the Continental General little time to ruminate on the American rout at Kip's Bay. Washington had positioned his men in a series of entrenched lines extending north from the Hollow Way, a small valley near what is present-day 125th Street, reaching as far back to what is now 160th Street. The first line was commanded by General Greene, where he had with him 3,300 troops. The fatigued men of General Putnam's brigades lay a half-mile behind them, and the rest were positioned further to the north, near Fort Washington and King's Bridge. Just before daybreak the morning following the disaster at Kip's Bay, on September 16th, George Washington sent Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Knowlton and his New England Rangers south through Hollow Way to scout the British positions, which were expected to be near Bloomingdale, next to the Hudson River. After sending this detachment, Washington began a report to Congress that articulated the disastrous events of the previous day. As succinctly and optimistically as he could, he then detailed his position within Harlem Heights, confidently asserting, "The enemy would be met with a defeat in case of attack, if the generality of our troops would behave with tolerable resolution." He then went on to temper any expectations by adding, "Experience, to my extreme affliction, has convinced me that this is rather to be wished than expected." Washington had not offered the last stroke of his pen upon the parchment when he was interrupted with news that the British were moving on the American positions in 3 columns. Washington ordered Major General Joseph Reed to investigate at once. As Reed rode out past the American lines, he discovered that the sizable British force described in earlier reports was misguided, and that the actual numbers were far fewer. Then he witnessed Knowlton's Rangers exchanging fire with the enemy. The Rangers had made it just a mile south that morning before coming into contact with British pickets, where the Crown soldiers opened fire on the New Englanders, which alerted a small contingent of light infantry redcoats to come forward and reinforce the pickets. As the number of men in the skirmish tipped in the redcoats' favor, Knowlton executed a fighting withdrawal and fell back behind a stone wall, where they poured a continuous fire upon the British. The British would continue to advance, forcing the Rangers to give up their position and dash back towards the American lines. They had gone toe-to-toe with some of General Howe's most revered troops, including the notorious Black Watch of the Royal Highlanders 42nd Regiment. While the Rangers had engaged their foe admirably that morning, the sight of Americans in retreat was becoming a rather familiar one for the newly arrived British soldiers. As Knowlton's men made their exit, the pursuing British light infantry sounded their bugle horns just as they would customarily do after a fox chase. The audacious act had roused the proud yet demoralized Americans. Eager to show they were not just a tepid animal to be scattered about, Washington had designs on exactly how to claw back some respect from the antagonistic British and elevate the dwindling spirits of his men. The redcoats had advanced upon the Americans in a way that had overextended their lines, leaving them vulnerable to counterattack, and Washington had every intention of making them pay for their hubris. The American general ordered 150 volunteers from the Brigade of Massachusetts and Rhode Island troops to attack straight at the advancing British. This movement was designed as a feint, keep the redcoats fixed in place. While this exchange was taking place, Washington ordered Knowlton's Rangers and 3 rifle companies from Major Leitch's 3rd Virginia to swing around the British, then attack them from the rear. Washington stated of this bold endeavor, "I formed the design of cutting off such of them as had, or might, advance to the extremity of the wood." The commander-in-chief's plan would ensnare the highly regarded British regiments, cutting them down to a man as they closed ranks upon them. As the Americans of the forward feint passed into the Hollow Way, the redcoats took the bait and moved further into the open. The British ran to and fro, from fences and rocks, positioning themselves to receive the colonial assault. But once the American column surprisingly came to a halt, the British began to advance on them in small parties. Under strict orders, the Americans were to hold their fire, but when the Crown troops were just 250 yards from their line, a young, green officer nervously let off a shot from his musket. Colonel Whedon of the 3rd Virginia cried out for the men to hold their fire, but his words were muffled by the sounds of the rest of the American troops following suit, and they unleashed a scattered volley upon the various bands of British troops. The effect was such that it preoccupied the British for the better part of the next hour, and allowed Knowlton's Rangers to circle around the Redcoats on their right, but their trajectory delivered the force not to the direct rear of the British, but to their immediate flank. The fatal impact of the attack had been diminished by the miscalculation, yet it still delivered one of the greatest American offensive moves the young war had seen yet to date. Knowlton led his men in a charge of the enemy, with the Rangers unleashing a vicious fire. In this opening exchange of the surprise attack, Leitch was struck twice with British musket fire. He stayed on his feet and valiantly urged his men forward. A third shot brought him to the ground, and he was carried from the field, in agony and mortally wounded. Knowlton would then be struck by a musket ball that tore through his lower back and dropped him to the ground. Captain Stephen Brown would come to his aid, asking the colonel the severity of his wound. Knowlton confirmed its significance, but stressed, "I do not value my life if we do but get the day." Knowlton was carried to the back of the line. Joseph Reed placed the leader of the Rangers upon his own horse. It was clear to Reed he had suffered a mortal wound, but he remembered of the colonel, when gasping in the agonies of death, all his inquiry was if we had driven in the enemy. Within the hour, Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Knowlton was dead. The multi-front attack had left the British reeling, and sensing that victory was at hand, Washington sent forth more troops to the fight. Regiments from Maryland and Connecticut arrived to the front lines, then at once delivered a ferocious attack upon their cross-Atlantic adversaries. Though they were relatively green soldiers, they had no qualms in taking full advantage of being on the upper-handed side of a battle at long last. The increased pressure began to drive some of the British into the woods. Others broke ranks and headed south into the wheat fields, yet their officers would succeed in rallying them, and reinforcements for the British arrived in varying stages of consequence as a stand-up firefight ensued for the next 2 hours. With munitions for both sides dwindling, Washington grew concerned of a potential British counterattack, and he sent an officer to the front with orders for the Americans to disengage and return to their defensive lines. 33 Americans were killed in the fighting, with more than 100 additional men wounded. The British, however, suffered the brunt of the exchange. Official numbers on losses written by General Howe and his British counterparts were often intentionally misleading, but based on the observable battlefield dead and the dozens of large bloodstains that adorned the former British positions of the engagement, it is estimated the Crown had suffered as many as 300 casualties that mid-September day. In stark contrast to their condition just hours before, the Americans left the battlefield with a spring in their step, giving a triumphant hurrah in unison as they made their way back towards the Harlem Heights encampments. Washington made note of this marked change in demeanor, and what may have been, at least in spirit, the salvation of his emerging army. He wrote, "A surprising and most incredible effect upon our whole army. Every visage was seen to brighten, and to assume, instead of the gloom and despair, the glow of animation." In the aftermath of the American troops' withdrawal from New York City, a fire was set on the morning of September 21st near the southern tip of Manhattan. The flames soon raged north, consuming over 1,000 homes, and only a southeasterly wind that corralled the flames near the river prevented the entire city from being razed. The British suspected the fire was the act of turncoat arsonists, and in a fervor rounded up over 200 patriot rebels. Many were lynched by loyalists. The British could not gather enough evidence to render a conviction on any of the Americans for the fire, though they would capture one of Washington's spies, Nathan Hale, on the evening after the fire. Hale was a member of Knowlton's Rangers, and the recently deceased lieutenant colonel had been tasked with developing a spy ring on Washington's behalf. The young Nathan Hale had been reconnoitering on behalf of the Americans in New York City, and the loss of both men would be a blow to the newly developed intelligence operation of the commander-in-chief. Undercover as a Dutch schoolteacher, Hale had been found to have incriminating documents on his person after he had been detained. Nathan Hale was executed by hanging the following day, and famously offered these last words before his sentence was carried out. My only regret is that I have but one life to lose for my country. Washington would enjoy hearing the reports of the Manhattan fire and state he wished more of the city had been burned, but he would never officially be connected to the cause of it, and it's unlikely he would have foregone the orders from Congress to commission it. Nevertheless, Washington had salvaged something of his plans to make the British pay a bloody toll for their acquisition of what now truly was the Empire City. The victory, albeit small, in the Battle of Harlem Heights, buoyed the spirits of his men, but it also hardened the resolve of General Howe and his staunch force to purge their rebellious desires from the face of the continent for good. But the impending clashes between the mighty British Empire and her defiant former subjects are, for tonight, other stories for other times. Late September 1776, Harlem Heights, New York. Commander-in-Chief George Washington of the upstart Continental Army has just secured a critical battlefield victory in a clash against the notoriously stout Black Watch Highlanders and their redcoat compatriots. It was a much-needed reprieve from the successive losses the Americans had suffered against the British Empire that summer. With significant losses at the Battle of Long Island and Kips Bay, control of New York City had fallen into the hands of King George III once more. As Washington miraculously managed to elude total defeat in the twilight of both battles, General Howe marched his troops north to Harlem Heights to expel the rebel colonists from New York City proper for good. A daring tactical move by the American general, led by Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Knowlton of the well-stocked New England Rangers, saw the colonial forces drive forward into the advancing British, then take their flank with an attack circling the Rangers that inflicted heavy casualties upon the British before Washington pulled his forces back as munitions grew sparse for both sides. The stalemate elevated the spirits of the fledgling American forces who had been underfed, marginally trained, and on the run from General Howe's forces since their first exchange upon Long Island. It was a bittersweet victory for Washington, as Lieutenant Colonel Knowlton was cut down in the fight, as were a number of other officers. Knowlton had also been in charge of operating the first American espionage ring at the commander's request. A few key prisoner exchanges with the British would help Washington shore up his chain of command with seasoned veterans. However, Washington would also lose a valuable asset in New York City when the young Nathan Hale, one of Knowlton's own Rangers turned spy, was arrested and hanged by British forces as a citywide crackdown took place following a massive fire that threatened to engulf the Empire City after the American army withdrew. Washington wrote a nuanced request to Congress, imploring them to provide him with men that were to be conscripted on a permanent basis, with salary, pension, and land grants as part of the offer to recruit and maintain a considerably more professional fighting force. Congress declined the request and would continue to put off doing so for years to come. On October 11th, in the waters of Valcour Bay of Lake Champlain, in upstate New York near the Quebec border, the United States Navy engaged in one of the first battles of the Revolutionary War, and to that effect, one of the first in its history. The Americans under the command of Benedict Arnold had drawn the British fleet into Valcour Bay in an attempt to diminish their opponent's inherent advantages. When the exchange broke in favor of the Royal Navy, an attempt to escape from the British up to Crown Point faced severe weather that stalled the American retreat and resulted in the vast majority of the young Navy's ships being grounded, destroyed, and burned. The Americans managed to inflict some damage upon the British, but would suffer far greater losses themselves, to the toll of 200 casualties, with several critical ships destroyed, including the USS Philadelphia. The British losses were tallied at 40 casualties and 3 gunboats lost. As consequential as this battle would be to the Americans' efforts, it wasn't the most pressing issue of the day for General Washington to address. At Throg's Neck, a small peninsula extending out from the edge of the Bronx, 4,000 British and Hessian troops were transported on 80 sails that navigated through Hell Gate into Long Island Sound, landed, and threatened to trap Washington's army between themselves and the Crown troops in New York City. Howe was once again attempting to turn the Americans' flank, which he had done to great success on Long Island. Yet the Royal General soon discovered he had made a grave miscalculation. The terrain consisted of thick marshes that forced the Crown troops through 2 bottlenecks with stone fences lining the nearby roads. The lands were highly favorable to American defensive positions, with a colonial officer stating to Washington, "I think if they are well lined with troops, we can make a considerable slaughter, if not discomfort them totally." Washington would manage to halt the invading force with just 2,000 of his men. This action served as a much-needed dose of reality for the American commander, rousing him to the notion that Howe was actively moving to cut him off from an exit path out of Harlem. On October 16th, Washington convened a council of war in his Harlem Heights headquarters in the Morris House. The main army would head out the next day for White Plains to the north, with a meager garrison of 1,200 men left behind to man Fort Washington upon the Hudson River, with the tall task of holding the fort while preventing the passage of British ships. On the 18th, 3 miles north of Throg's Neck, thousands of British soldiers came ashore. Had Washington waited just 2 days longer, he would have been enveloped by the British. Now that he had escaped once again, however, General Howe did not give chase. Then, on the 21st of October, the Crown troops advanced to New Rochelle, in Westchester County. The main contingent of the Continental Army arrived in White Plains on the 22nd, with Washington setting his headquarters at the Elijah Miller House, a 600-acre farm located 2 miles north of town. Washington set his defensive lines at White Plains extending out across a 3-mile line, bookended by a lake on the left and Chatterton Hill on the right. This 1-mile ridge held the key to the entire American entrenchment. Dense trees lined the southern end of it, and the Bronx River ran just below. Washington, by some glaring lack of foresight or tactical misstep, did not put any fortifications upon the hill, instead stationing several hundred militia upon it, of which he had desired to remove from the main body of troops due to behavioral concern brought upon by their juvenile predispositions, and then had neglected it thereafter. The commander-in-chief had failed to even explore the grounds at large of White Plains until the morning of the battle. As Washington finally engaged in an eyes-on inspection of the lines on October 28th, the House vanguard were spotted by his skirmishes. The general rode atop Chatterton Hill. His second, Charles Lee, pointed to the north, stating that was the preferred ground they should be positioning themselves within. As Washington and Lee began to trek towards the site, they were called after by a light horseman. "The British are on the camp, sir." Washington turned about and said, "We've now other business than reconnoitering," then dashed off towards camp at full gallop. Upon arriving at the center of the line, he informed his officers in a cold and direct manner to take their respective posts and do the best they could. The general then took priority in reinforcing the small militia assembled atop the hill with a few pieces of artillery and 1,000 Continental troops who took up their arms behind stone walls that lined the crest of the hill. Then the militia moved to the lower edge of the hill on the right. Howe arrived at the American lines that day with just 13,000 men in tow, most of whom were grizzled German Hessian mercenaries, known for their penchant of taking sadistic liberties when their foe was finally prepared to acquiesce. The British commander saw at once the crucial placement of Chatterton Hill and attacked it directly with 2 columns. The first, the Hessian Brigade, under the direction of Johann Gottlieb Rahl. They held their fire and charged upon the militia lining the extreme right of the hill. They expelled the colonists from their position with relative ease, and carried on for the crest of the hill. The second column, another Hessian denomination, attacked the front of the hill, but were bogged down as they struggled across the Bronx River and absorbed heavy fire from the Americans. The 2 British regiments to their rear became restless, finding their way across the stream at a section of considerably less depth. Then they mocked the Hessians as they advanced up the hill, still in column. The halted Hessians could only watch as the advancing British line was met with a heavy assault of grape shot. Yet they persisted in spite of their substantial losses, and in due time, the Hessian professionals were advancing in support of their rear. The Maryland regiment then attacked downhill, attempting to scatter the surging column, but amidst the chaotic melee, they could not organize themselves into an effective offensive force, and were scattered about. Still, the artillery of the Americans inflicted further punishment. The legend of Sleepy Hollow is drawn from the lore of this battle, as tales of a Hessian cavalryman beheaded by a cannonball that was seen still galloping up the ravine were spread by Americans. In a reversal of fortune for the colonials, the British artillery then went to work upon them in devastating fashion. A member of the Connecticut Regiment recalled bearing witness to the work of just one projectile. A cannonball cut down Lieutenant Young's platoon, which was next to that of mine. The ball first took the head of Smith, a stout, heavy man, and dashed it open. Then it took off Chisholm's arm, which was amputated. It then took Taylor across the bowels, and then struck Sergeant Garrett of our company on the hip, and took off the point of the hip bone. Those men with their legs and guns and packs, all in a heap. With the militia to their right in full retreat, and the redcoats pressing towards them with bayonets fixed, the Continentals broke apart and fell back. Washington would pay a heavy toll were he to now attempt to take back the hill. Instead, he pulled his troops back to installations due east of White Plains. The defeat had jarred a still reeling American force, in spite of the fact that British and Hessian casualties numbered a total of 276, almost double the amount incurred by the Americans. But the bitter taste the Continentals were left with came predominantly from the regret of a missed opportunity. Having begun with such an advantageous position atop Chatterton Hill, and a doggedly determined foe willing to shed substantial blood to dispossess it from the Americans, they had failed to capitalize on the chance to inflict significant carnage upon their pursuers, and more importantly, to secure a psychological victory over what had proven to be, at this stage, a superior adversary. Perhaps the greatest missed opportunity belonged, yet again, to General Howe, who once more deferred the chance to pursue after a retreating Washington. Instead, Howe spent the next 3 days considering his options before deciding to attack on the morning of October 31st. Amidst word of the British movements, and under cover of night and heavy rainfall, Washington disappeared into the ether once again, dispatching with his troops to the north and raising everything they could within White Plains as they made their exit, burning barns, slaughtering livestock, and leaving many Americans homeless in their wake. The apprehension General Howe displayed in his lethargic pursuit of the Continental Army garnered him the nickname Granny Howe from his men. This said, of course, in jest and only around specific company. A former officer of Howe would write, "Sir William seemed to have calculated just the amount of time needed for the enemy to make their escape." A range of theories have been floated by scholars and historians as to what brought on the British commander's predisposition for such complacency. Howe would even be questioned directly after the war by his own government as to why he had not pursued Washington more aggressively when given the chance at White Plains. The general could only muster the laconic retort, "For political reasons." Attempting to ascertain what he meant by this, historians have debated several possibilities. In all likelihood, it stemmed from a gentlemanly desire to negotiate a surrender without having to procure a complete annihilation of the Continental Army. Yet, the floated possibilities spanned from his not wanting to expose a loyalist spy who had been feeding him intelligence on Washington's plans and locations, to a powerful influence above him within the government that had handed down an edict to guide his actions beyond what is understood about the British designs on war, and lastly, and perhaps most glaringly, that the mistress he had taken in Boston during the months-long siege of the city, the wife of British naval officer Joshua Loring, had preoccupied his mind and usurped his better instincts. Judge Thomas Jones, a loyalist historian, compared Howe to Mark Antony, declaring, "Sir William sacrificed an empire for the charms of his Boston Cleopatra." In early November, Howe would abandon White Plains and head back to Manhattan, where he stated he had unfinished business to attend to. Nevertheless, after another defeat, the outlook for the Continental Army heading into the winter was beyond bleak. It would take bold and cunning action from General George Washington to reinvigorate his men's purpose and claw the young nation back into this epic fight. And he would devise a plan to do just that in 2 short months' time, on the night of Christmas, 1776. But Washington's fabled crossing of the Delaware is, for tonight, another story for another time. December 25th, 1776, the Delaware River, 8 miles outside of Trenton, New Jersey. General George Washington, fraught with a terrible consternation not only about the treacherous night mission he was now undertaking, but with the whole of the revolutionary desires of the young nation whose future he had been entrusted with preserving. The commander-in-chief and 2,400 of his men set across the icy rivers of the Delaware on that momentous Christmas night in flat ferries and Durham boats, small, well-built vessels designed to bring ore downriver to Philadelphia. With the enlistments of his entire army coming due in just 1 week's time, Washington had staked the fortunes of his men, his new nation, and the actualization of the ideals of the Age of Enlightenment on this one bold and daring quest. A tactical envelopment of the Hessian mercenaries' winter quarters. If it worked, the American cause could find new life in this bitter war. The iconic Virginian had boiled down the whole of everything riding upon his shoulders that night into 3 simple yet unforgettable words: victory or death. Just 2 months prior, Commander-in-Chief George Washington had arrived with his forces in White Plains, positioning them in a broad defensive line spanning 3 miles. A critical error was made by the American general in placing an inexperienced and undisciplined militia detachment upon Chatterton Hill, the key to the American line. It wasn't until Washington finally decided to examine his entrenchments on the morning of October 28th that he would be informed that the British were advancing upon them. With little time to make adjustments, the Virginian ordered more regiments to the hill with a few pieces of field artillery. When Hessian and British forces moved on the hill, they paid a heavy toll thanks to the American cannonade, but they would quickly turn the tide of the battle and impose their own devastating artillery assault upon the Americans. Then, take their critical high ground position, thus forcing Washington to abandon his lines entirely prior to consuming White Plains and strategically set fires before ceding the town to the Brits and heading north away from the reach of General Howe's forces once again. Because the enlistments of American soldiers in the Continental Army were set for just 12 months, on January 1, 1777, Washington faced the prospect of losing his entire army, devastating any hope of success for the American cause. Washington would write another of what were becoming his voluminous pleas to Congress, petitioning them in as persuasive a manner as he possibly could to delegate further funds towards the recruitment, enlistment, and compensation of a permanent military force that would serve for the duration of the war. The general asked for additional powers to be granted to him, that he have the ability to offer re-enlistment bonuses to current troops, as well as the use of land grants for completed terms of services. Washington penned in his letter that Congress had put far too much stock in patriotism, stating that they feared paying them well would turn them into mercenaries. He professed, "When men are irritated and passions inflamed, they fly hastily and cheerfully to arms, but after the first emotions are over, to expect that they are influenced by any other principles than those of interest is to look for what never did, and I fear never will, happen. The few, therefore, that act upon the principles of disinterestedness are, comparatively speaking, no more than a drop in the ocean. Placing any depends upon such militia is akin to resting upon a broken staff." The commander-in-chief gave an itemized outline of the specific dollar amount, acreage of land, and materials provided that he would require to achieve the necessary army to achieve victory. The disposition of Congress was that the general was bordering on the cusp of securing what could easily become despotic powers. They feared that they would be trading one king for another if they were to grant Washington such singular authority, but they were also aware of what their bleak reality would become were they to lose this fight with the British Empire. They settled on adorning the Virginian with some of his requested powers, including the ability to offer bounties to encourage re-enlistments to selected men, but the abilities were given for terms of just 6 months. Congress also agreed to enlist a new army beginning with the dissolution of the current force, but failed to recognize the inherent difficulties with undertaking such a task for the American military high command and the inexperienced nature of the troops, who would much prefer a 6-week enlistment in the militia over the paltry salary offered by the Continental Army. General Howe would choose not to pursue the Americans further into northern New York after their victory at White Plains, but would instead turn his attention towards the last remaining American stronghold on the island of Manhattan, Fort Washington. The fortification would have been burned and abandoned by the Americans during their retreat from New York City, but Congress demanded it be held as long as possible to prevent British ships from using the Hudson River as a passage north to Lake George. This gave them command of the waterways that could effectively sever New England off from the rest of the nation. The twin forts of Washington and Lee, set across from one another on either side of the Hudson, had been designed to keep this disastrous possibility from coming to fruition. Yet their inability to prevent 3 British ships from passing to the north proved how ineffectual they truly were. Washington would write to Greene on November 8th, "If we cannot prevent vessels from passing up, and the enemy are possessed of the surrounding country, what valuable purpose can it answer to attempt to hold a post which the expected benefit cannot be had. Washington did not order Greene to evacuate his position at the fort, and Greene would dismiss the concerns the commander-in-chief had expressed, citing a failed attempt to overtake the barriers of the fort on October 27. The American general arrived to inspect the fort of his namesake on November 12 and spent 3 days analyzing the men, the structure, and the readiness they held for what would be an inevitable siege attempt by the British. Washington would cross the river and stay at Fort Lee on November 14th, and while he slept, 30 British boats rowed north up the Hudson, past the American fortifications undetected, then entered the Harlem River to the north of Fort Washington. The British general had delivered a message to Greene from King's Bridge. With an incendiary tone, he ordered immediate and total surrender, or face every man being put to the sword. Greene was given just 2 hours to give his answer. He would tell Washington that the troops are in high spirits and they would make a good defense. The attack began on November 16th just after 10 o'clock that morning. A coalition of more than 5,000 British and Hessian troops converged upon the fort from 3 directions. The Americans fought hard. Washington was present within his namesake fort while the attack on the exterior defensive entrenchments got underway. Initially, he felt hope that they would endeavor to repulse the enemy and hold the fort. A German Hessian mercenary would recount the devastating effects of the American rebuttal they endured in the early stages of the battle. Before us, beside and behind us, we saw our unfortunate comrades lying beside and upon one another. They lay battered and in part shattered, dead on the earth in their own blood. Some whimpering, looked at us, pleading in one way or another that we would ease their suffering and unbearable pain. In spite of these heavy casualties, the British and German men pressed on until they had driven the Americans back into the walls of Fort Washington. At this time, the American command of Washington, Greene, Putnam, and Mercer evacuated Fort Washington, crossing the river to Fort Lee, and within 30 minutes, the entire structure was completely surrounded. Just after 3 p.m., McGraw surrendered along with 2,800 Americans. Aside from the abhorrent conditions the Continentals would now be subjected to, with many bludgeoned by their German captors, the loss of nearly 3,000 men that day was an astounding failure that directly fell on Washington. Questions about his ability to command the Americans to any semblance of victory grew louder, with some calling for him to be replaced as commander-in-chief. Cornwallis would take Fort Lee just days later, while the 2,000-man garrison managed to evade capture. Their equipment and artillery would fall into the hands of the British. Cornwallis would chase the Americans, now just a scant force of 4,000 fatigued, malnourished, and demoralized men, through New Jersey, with Washington leading them to safety in Pennsylvania when Howe again ordered a halt to the British pursuit. The American citizens of eastern New Jersey, who had now fallen under Crown rule once more, faced vicious abuse from the conquering army. Many fled from their homes as refugees to the south to more hospitable lands. On December 11th, Congress convened and ordered a day of fasting and prayer as the situation for the young nation grew ever more dire by the passing day. They then granted Washington complete authority to carry on the war, and afterwards abandoned Philadelphia and moved their future proceedings to Baltimore. On the 13th, the Continental Army's second-in-command, Major General Charles Lee, was captured in a tavern by 70 British cavalry in Basking Ridge, New Jersey. Lee had ignored Washington's orders to cross the Delaware and join him in Trenton Falls, opting instead for the opportunity to achieve glory and increase his stock with Congress by launching his own attack on the British in New Jersey. Lee had been separated from the main body of his troops, where he was captured with ease and transported to New York City. The following day, after the general was taken into custody, General Howe called an official end to the British campaign season of 1776 and sent his army into winter quarters. Howe would station the men in several detachments throughout town in and around New York City and throughout New Jersey. He felt this separation of forces would be under no threat from the beleaguered Americans who were on their last legs after a devastating summer and fall. American General Joseph Reed wrote the commander-in-chief in an attempt to rouse them from their perishing state. "We are all of opinion, my dear General, that something must be attempted to revive our expiring credit for even a failure cannot be more fatal than to remain in our present situation. Some enterprises must be undertaken in our present circumstances, or we must give up the cause. On December 20th, General Sullivan, who had been captured and then released as part of a prisoner exchange, was able to gather together Lee's men, some 2,000 in total, and trek them through a blizzard to Washington's camp. With this detachment, as well as Horatio Gates' 600 Continentals and 1,000 Philadelphia militia, Washington had under his immediate command a force of over 6,000 men, with little time to make use of them. On the 22nd, a council of war was held with all of the American high command and several officers, one of whom happened to be a Loyalist spy. They listened as Washington presented the locations of all the British and Hessian placements that adorned New Jersey. The target of the assault was not determined during this meeting, and the spy was left with only the concept of an attack to report to the British. Later that night, around only his most trusted officers, the final plan would be set in place. The night that followed Christmas Day, the Americans would cross the Delaware River, then launch their attempt upon Trenton, where Hessian officer Johann Rall and 1,500 mercenaries made their quarters. Washington would cross the Delaware 8 miles north of Trenton at McConkey's Ferry, then turn right, marching through the night to position themselves to the north and east of the Germans. At Trenton, Brigadier General James Ewing would take 600 militia and capture the Assunpink Bridge on the south side of town, preventing the Germans from retreating across it. Colonel John Cadwallader would attack Bristol with 2,400 New England and Pennsylvanian militia, undercutting Denope and his men stationed there from reinforcing Rall in Trenton. Washington would then ask General Putnam to gather his militia and follow behind Cadwallader, acting as reserves. Once the orders were given, Washington felt the weight of the daring plan fall heavily upon him as he sat passing the hours on the morning of Christmas Eve in his headquarters. Benjamin Rush would enter his office and see a parchment that the tobacco baron turned commander-in-chief had penned, lying on the floor. It held the Virginians' summation of their shared condition. Rush stared upon the paper and read some of the general's most famous words: victory or death. On Christmas Day, the American troops equipped themselves with muskets, cartridges, and flints, some even wrapping their bare feet with ripped cloth, with no shoes or boots to traverse the snow-covered landscape in. They made their way to the Delaware River, where thick blocks of ice had formed as the temperature sank below freezing. A bright moon was muted by the heavy snowfall of the nor'easter that brought with it piercing, howling winds. Colonel Knox was placed in charge of the river crossing, and the hulking, near 300-pound officer was credited with carrying it out under these dire conditions. He oversaw the transport of 18 pieces of artillery and a cavalcade of nervous horses. As the infantrymen made the voyage, some were plunged into the icy stream, but no man was lost amidst the crossing. Washington's chief concern became the extended length of time it took to complete it, with the operation now 3 hours behind schedule. He feared the element of surprise in the nighttime raid could be lost. Once they arrived on the opposite shore, Washington allowed the men to build bonfires to warm themselves, feeling the snowstorm would prevent them from being spotted by the Hessian outposts. A long and toiling march would then get underway, with the Americans trudging through the snow-covered terrain. A scouting party of 40 men, under the command of William Washington, a cousin of the American commander, ran point on the expedition, with orders to catch anyone who crossed their path, be it civilian or soldier. The different American detachments under Roche-Vermont, Sullivan, and Greene blocked every route of escape to the north. Just before daybreak, after 7 o'clock in the morning, after a sleepless night charting a path through the dark and cold, the American line came to a halt. Upon his horse, traveling towards the front of the column, Washington gave a terse, yet measured instruction to his men. "Keep by your officers, for God's sake. Keep by your officers." One Loyalist farmer would see the movement of the American troops and head to the Hessians' location. He would attempt to deliver a message to Colonel Johann Rall during a Christmas feast, and the prevailing accounts of what occurred next are that he received the note after much protest from the farmer, placed it in his pocket, and never read it. Another version offers that he was told the Americans were moving to attack, and he responded dismissively, "Let them come. The tension amongst the Patriot troops was palpable, as an uncertain yet determined air permeated their ranks. The snow had turned into a driving sleet and rain as the sun rose on Trenton on the morning of December 26th. The battle that held within it the destiny of the upstart American nation would commence when Greene's division launched an attack on the Hessian outposts, followed immediately with an advance by Sullivan's men, repulsing the German pickets as they fell upon Trenton in concert. The Hessian outposts assumed that these were just loosely assembled American forces coming forth to pester them, as had been the case the last several nights. Those small attacks had been done in an effort to disrupt the sleep of the Hessians in preparation for the large-scale offensive, and when the outposts came to behold the fervor and size of the attack that was upon them, they made an abrupt withdrawal back towards the town. Washington rode to the front of the Virginia Brigade, then led them into the heart of the town, where the Hessians had hastily formed into defensive positions, still attempting to gain their bearings. The Hessians manned their artillery and began offering a heavy fire upon the Americans. Then, the massive Colonel Knox brought an American cannon forward, unleashing a furious bombardment into the concentrated column of German mercenaries. In just minutes, the Europeans began to break ranks and flee into the side streets and fields near the town, as the American cannonade continued to devastate their lines without remorse. The abject violence, chaos, and deafening sound was an overwhelming experience even to the American forces, who took great pleasure in punishing their brutish and bloodthirsty foe. The booming cannons and the sounds of grape shot and musket fire clashing against the stone roads and bridges rang out as a horrid symphony, while the streets of Trenton were painted red with Hessian blood. Colonel Johann Rall gave no indication that he expected this assault, as it took his men 3 attempts to rouse him from his sleep that morning. Rall haphazardly attempted to dress himself as he made his way into the streets of Trenton that morning, attempting to draw together his troops into the town's center. Just 2 artillery charges were set off before the Americans fell upon them, forcing the Hessians to abandon them, with another 2 jamming and becoming unusable on the account of their fried-out touchpans. Rall persisted, gathering his remaining men and the regiment of von Lossberg, and commanded them into an apple orchard on the outset of town. The colonel at last managed to formulate that his men were increasingly considering retreat, yet the Hessian colonel quickly found himself ensnared by the Americans as Sullivan had entered Trenton from the west, and Glover had taken the bridge and then marched north, cutting off their last escape route. Johann Rall had no plans of surrender, and made a futile attempt at retaking Trenton, with no artillery, facing an imposing force, multitudes size of their own, and well positioned. Still, the Hessians were resolute in the face of assured death, and marched forward to the tune of their drummer towards the Americans. The final insult in the comedy of errors that was the Hessian rebuttal to the Americans was the driving rains rendering their fled cartridges useless, preventing them from even returning fire. Rall, now upon his horse, was then struck with 2 lethal shots from American muskets, and he slooped forward in his saddle. Upon his demise, his men fled from the battlefield in disorganized desperation. Within minutes, the whole of the remaining Hessian force would throw down their weapons and concede. 650 would manage to escape. 893 would be taken captive, with 22 killed in action, including all 4 Hessian colonels present at the battle, and another 83 men seriously wounded. The Americans suffered 2 deaths from exposure brought about by the night march, and 5 men wounded, including future President James Monroe. The Americans would also capture badly needed food, clothing, and medical supplies. The Hessian prisoners would be sent to Philadelphia, and the exhausted yet galvanized Americans retraced their steps back to the Delaware River, crossed its icy waters, and returned to their camp. On the last day of 1776, just before the enlistment of the soldiers of the Continental Army was to expire, George Washington would make an impassioned plea to his men. "My brave fellows, you have done all I have asked you to do, and more than can be reasonably expected. But your country is at stake. Your wives, your houses, and all that you hold dear. You have worn yourselves out with fatigues and hardships, but we know not how to spare you. If you will consent to stay 1 month longer, you will render that service to the cause of liberty, and to your country, which you can probably never do under any other circumstances. Roughly half of the men who heard Washington's words would agree to stay on. The Battle of Trenton had saved the cause of the American nation, but their war for independence was far from over, as the awakened British Empire would move swiftly to dampen the spirits of the rebellious Continentals. But the many tales of blood and heroism that would follow in the Revolutionary War are, for tonight, other stories for other times. January 17th, 1781, Cherokee County, South Carolina. Just before sunrise, Lieutenant Colonel Bannister Tarleton led a column of men, some 1,150 strong, through the Carolina hills directly into the waiting lines of American Brigadier General Daniel Morgan. A highly confident Tarleton was prepared to unleash a furious assault of infantry, cannon, and cavalry upon the much despised Morgan and his ragged yet cunning band of resistance fighters. What Bannister was not aware of was that Morgan had foreseen this move from the British and had prepared his men in a series of defensive lines, utilizing the varied elevation of the landscape to hide the main body of his forces. They were under orders to execute Morgan's masterful plan of drawing the British in with a line of militiamen as bait, then consuming the king's forces as a series of encirclements that could earn the brigadier general the moniker American Hannibal, but only if things went according to plan. Daniel Morgan was born in Hunterdon County, New Jersey, in the mid-1730s. The son of Welsh parents, he left home at the tender age of 17 after a quarrel with his father. With a quick temper and a strong resolve, confrontation was rooted in the core of Morgan's being. He would spend a few years working as a teamster on the frontier, eventually buying his own wagons, and would even be contracted to work for the British during the French and Indian War. After the failed Braddock expedition came to a deadly end at the Battle of the Monongahela, Morgan took exception with his treatment by a British officer and slapped the head of the royally commissioned soldier. In response, upon their arrival back from the battle, Morgan was sentenced to 500 lashes with a cat o' nine tails. Daniel Morgan stood defiantly as he was scourged, counting along with the British during every flesh-tearing blow. The punishment, while usually fatal, would fail to put an end to the pugnacious frontiersman. The heartless damnation he had been handed down would, however, instill in him a relentless detestation for his British antagonizers and the Crown's treatment for their colonial subjects. Upon the outbreak of the Revolutionary War, Morgan would finally be given the opportunity to engage in his long-sought retribution. The Virginia Commonwealth raised 2 companies to send to Boston, one of which was led by Captain Daniel Morgan. His contingent of 96 frontiersmen were no greenhorns. They were a seasoned unit that had become well-versed in low-intensity skirmishes during Dunmore's War. They would adopt a style of woodland combat they had learned from the natives, and would soon earn the name Morgan's Riflemen. The Kentucky long rifles they carried, with their spiral-grooved barrels, could knock down a target 300 yards away. Seeking to inflict maximum damage, Morgan gave orders to his men to target British officers. They did so with such devastating success, it drew the ire of not only the British, but also that of the American Commander-in-Chief, George Washington, who felt the approach was too undignified. Morgan would see significant action in the early years of the Revolutionary War, even being captured in Canada, and when offered a pardon were he to swear his allegiance to the king, he coolly replied, "Do not insult me again." He would later be freed in a prisoner exchange. Upon his release, George Washington would petition Congress to promote Morgan, writing he would recommend to the particular notice of Congress Captain Daniel Morgan, a good and valuable officer, a fit and proper person to succeed. Morgan was given the rank of colonel, and his men would play a crucial role in the American victory at Saratoga. While the early years of the war were highlighted by significant battles throughout the northern colonies, many of which were commanded in the field by General George Washington, in 1780, the Southern theater would rise to increasing prominence. Major General Charles Cornwallis was a fixture of the early British campaigns during the onset of the war in the Northeast. This success coming after a failed siege of Charleston under General Clinton in 1776. In November 1778, Cornwallis returned to England to tend to his ailing wife. She would pass that winter, and the British general would return to America and serve under Clinton once again, this time with designs on successfully capturing Charleston and then conquering the American South. In May 1780, the British would achieve their long-sought conquering of the coastal South Carolina town. After 6 long weeks of being under siege, Major General Benjamin Lincoln would surrender, along with 5,500 men and every one of their sloops, schooners, and frigates. It was one of the worst American defeats in the entirety of the war. September 1780 would see an uptick of movements throughout the South. At Hillsborough, Brigadier General Horatio Gates took command of an extremely depleted force. The 2 regiments that made up the main body of the Southern lines amounted to only 1,241 men, just over 900 of which were infantry. Morale was extremely low, even for the depressed standards of the Continental Army. In the North, Washington's army had its most recent engagement at Monmouth Courthouse in the spring of 1778. A strategic draw, Clinton would take the British into New York City, where they would entrench themselves in defensive positions, with their naval superiority commanding the shores around them. 2.5 years of stalemate had now passed, with Washington unwilling to lay siege to the impenetrable Empire City, and Clinton unwilling to pursue his foe and leave his advantageous stronghold. Major John Andre, an aide-de-camp to General Clinton, was captured with documents on his person signed by West Point commander Benedict Arnold. It was discovered that Arnold had been cooperating with the British for over a year. Andre would be hanged for his part in the malfeasance, but Benedict Arnold would escape and go on to become the most notorious turncoat and saboteur in American history. As Cornwallis brought his army to Charlotte that month, he fashioned his plans for garnering total control of the southern United States. Cornwallis sent troops north to Salisbury after he captured the Queen City, throwing North Carolina into a fit of hysteria, as the state legislators scrambled to come up with a solution to the royal encroachment. Horatio Gates knew his men were scarcely capable of standing toe-to-toe with Cornwallis's sizable force, but there were possible advantages the Americans held that he sought to exploit. First, a hit-and-run, antagonistic style of guerrilla raids could be used to weaken their enemy. This could allow for the Americans to increase morale, achieve small strategic victories, and avoid the bulk of their forces being captured, as had been the case at Charleston. Additionally, the irregular hill country of the Carolinas was little known to the British High Command. The varied topographical landscape could hold the key to delivering the Americans the upper hand. It just so happened that Horatio Gates had the perfect man to undertake both of these elements of fighting on behalf of the Americans. Daniel Morgan, the hard-fighting, hard-drinking gambler from Winchester, Virginia, was the picturesque embodiment of the rugged individualism that bore itself from the American frontier. Morgan was not one to be subjugated or talked down to. His temper had most recently flared up when a fellow officer spoke poorly of General Washington. Morgan came to the defense of, quote, His Excellency. Though the differences between the commander-in-chief and Daniel Morgan were vast, a mutual respect persisted amongst the two patriots. While Morgan had fervently sought a promotion in rank, he'd been repeatedly passed over. Gates sought to place Morgan with the North Carolina militia, yet his rank as a colonel in the Continental Army meant that others in the detachment could outrank him and subject him to their orders. Similar it was to George Washington's experience in the French and Indian War as a Virginia militia colonel seeking a royal officer commission. To remedy this, Morgan was given his long-desired rank of brigadier general. Done as something of a formality, Gates and Morgan could have hardly dreamt that this administrative decision would soon shape American history and alter the course of the young nation's quest for independence. Morgan was then given his own detachment to carry out his asymmetrical operation. 3 companies of Continental Infantry, 60 Virginia riflemen, and 70 cavalry that included the small body of dragoons led by William Washington, cousin to the top American general. The British had gone into their winter quarters in Winnsboro, South Carolina, allowing Morgan's brigade valuable time to organize and provision themselves, but their task would not wait until the spring to be carried out. Among the harassment offered to the British by Morgan's men that winter would be perhaps the most unlikely and comical victory for their unorthodox crusade. Colonel William Washington had left the sick in his camp, with tents up and campfires alight, to give the illusion that they still occupied it should any British pickets scout it out. Then he took his cavalry regiment, using an indirect backwoods path, to the garrison of Henry Rugeley. Washington secured the surrender of Rugeley and his men using only a pine knot and a brilliant bit of posturing. Otho Williams recounted the farcical success in his journal. It seems that Colonel Washington humorously ordered his men to plant the trunk of an old pine tree in the manner of a field piece, pointing towards the garrison, at the same time dismounting some of his men to appear as an infantry. Displaying his cavalry to the best advantage, he sent a corporal of dragoons to summon the commanding officer to an immediate surrender, no doubt insisting that once the American artillery opened fire, Mr. Rugeley's fort would be reduced to little more than splinters and the garrison flattened. 103 British surrendered to Colonel Washington without a single shot fired. Nathaniel Greene was selected by George Washington to be the commander of the Southern Department of the Continental Forces. Greene chose to divide his army, placing part of them under the command of Morgan. Additions to his detachment now included 400 soldiers from Delaware and Maryland, as well as several from the Virginia militia. Militia from South Carolina would be added to his forces before New Year's. Greene had tasked Morgan with guarding a territory to the southwest of Charlotte to protect its citizens and to forage the area. Cornwallis received word of Morgan's location and feared it threatened his men. He ordered Lieutenant Colonel Banastre Tarleton to attack their position and prevent the nearby British Fort 96 from falling under siege by the Americans. Tarleton, the spry 26-year-old officer, would head out on the night of January 16th, with a single column reinforced by the men of the 96. American scouts delivered word to Morgan of the British advance, and Morgan retreated to the north with his men. He selected his desired battlefield location for strategic and psychological benefit. The grass-covered knolls of the locale known as Hannah's Cow Pens, and its placement between the Pacalote River to their front and the Broad River to their rear, would ensure that the quick-to-retreat militiamen would have no easy exit, forcing them to stand and fight. Positioning his men between the two streams was not the only adjustment Morgan would make regarding the inexperienced segment of his forces. His plan would face his militia front and center, suspecting that the British would attack them head-on. This front line of novice troops would invariably break and begin to fall back. Morgan had designs on just that happening. The American general had placed his Continentals on the hill that the militia would retreat up, out of sight of the British. Colonel Washington's dragoons would be laying in wait behind the second line, with a detachment of pickets placed on the American right. The night before the battle, Daniel Morgan gave an impassioned speech to his men. He removed his shirt and showed the grisly, spiderweb scars that canvassed the flesh of his back and shoulders from his lashing. The ruthless and unforgiving nature of the British was emphasized, and the troops were implored to follow their orders to a letter, and that if they did so, a great victory for the Americans would be won. Before dawn on January 17th, Daniel Morgan watched from atop a hill the movements of Banastre Tarleton and his British column. Morgan bellowed out in his deep, booming voice, "Get up! Banny's coming!" The men grabbed their rifles and took their positions, then waited for the oncoming storm. Morgan rode down to the militia that comprised the front line, giving specific orders to the men not to fall back to the hill until they had delivered 2 volleys to the British at close range. Tarleton attempted to ascertain the distribution and stature of the American position that morning, but his failure to properly reconnoiter his adversary and the haste at which he had led his men into battle would prove utterly disastrous. Lieutenant Roderick Mackenzie, of the 71st Regiment, would recount the failures of Tarleton. Without the delay of a single moment, and despite of extreme fatigue, the Light Legion infantry and fusiliers were ordered to form in line. Before this order was put into execution, Major Newmar, who commanded the latter corps, posting his officers, the line far from incomplete, was led to the attack by Lieutenant Colonel Tarleton himself. Impatient and overconfident, Tarleton could not even await the proper deployment of his infantry before leading them forward into what, for virtually all of them, very soon amounted to death, injury, or capture. Once the British advance was within shooting range of the American front line, the South Carolina militia let loose a devastating opening salvo. Several British officers were targeted by the militia and were killed just as the battle had begun. The British then answered back with their own round of fire. The Crown muskets aimed high and did little damage to the militia. While Morgan had explicitly ordered the front line to fire 2 volleys before falling back to the position of the hidden Continentals, most began to retreat after the British offered their retort, with the cavalry covering for their withdrawal. The British light infantry made their charge, with bayonets fixed. The militia who had not fallen back then delivered their second shot, stunning the British advance and stopping them cold. The American Continentals took staggered steps between their lines to facilitate absorbing the retreating militia into their ranks. This nuance was put in place ahead of time by Morgan, who had exhaustively planned his vision for the battle down to every conceivable detail. The British, emboldened by the sight of their fleeing enemy, disregarded protocol and gave chase, breaking from their usually disciplined formation. As they crested the hill, salivating at the prospect of a day soon to be won, they locked eyes on the main body of the Continental Army that stood waiting to receive them. The stunned British had little time to react, as a torrential fire was opened upon them from just yards away. They were cut down wholesale, with staggering numbers of casualties inflicted. The third line of the Americans could only listen as the agonizing cries of their foe and the blistering sound of the musket fire consumed the air as they waited. Tarleton, aghast at what he had delivered his troops into, quickly attempted to course-correct and sent his dragoons to hunt down the fleeing militia that had not fallen back to the Continental's position, and the British cavalry soon fell upon them as their sabers glittered above their heads in the cold winter's sun. The British cavalry had become separated in their overconfident pursuit of the isolated Americans. Colonel William Washington's dragoons stormed down into the British horsemen, cutting through them before they even realized the error they'd committed. On the main line, the British and Americans traded hellacious blows. The calamitous fighting stimulated Tarleton to send the 71st Highlanders and the reserve cavalry to the American right flank, thinking this would serve as the coup de grace. The Scottish Highlanders marched upon the right flank of the Continentals. As their bagpipes pierced through the roar of the rifle fire, the order was given to reposition the American flank and face the Highlanders head-on, but the command became interpreted as a call for retreat. Company by company, the entire Continental line followed suit as they observed their peers falling back. American officer John Howard acted swiftly and used the opportunity of the retreating young men to reposition the lines to better address the flanking assault by the Scots. The quick-thinking Howard had saved the battle from disaster. The sight of the American retreat had given one final shot of adrenaline to the exhausted British infantry, who had been ensconced in a firefight after marching 30 miles through the night. As they charged forward in disorganized negligence, the reformed American line held their fire until some of the charging British were just yards away, and then the order was given for the Continentals to unleash their muskets in unison. A chorus fire, smoke, and lead rang out. The British took the brunt of the discharge head-on. John Howard felt the seismic shift in the battle brought upon by this measured and furious volley, and consumed with the palpable essence of victory at hand, cried out to his men, "Charge! Bayonets!" The battle that once appeared to be a toss-up had suddenly turned into an all-out massacre. The Americans gave chase, butchering the stunned redcoats as they stumbled across the sloped terrain, others falling to their knees, begging for mercy and offering their surrender. Tarleton had witnessed this astounding devolution and rode to his last remaining intact unit, the British Legion Cavalry, and ordered them to charge into the pursuing Americans, but they disregarded his command and fled from the battlefield. Colonel Washington's cavalry had fallen upon the British dragoons, and then the American commander-in-chief's young cousin found Tarleton and called out to him, "Where is now the boasting Tarleton?" A British cavalryman rode up to attack Washington, but was shot down by an American trumpeter. Washington managed to slash Tarleton's right hand with his saber, and Tarleton shot back towards Washington as he fled, grazing the American colonel's knee and wounding his horse. Washington gave Tarleton a tenacious pursuit, following him for 16 miles. Yet Tarleton managed to escape into a plantation. In the battle's immediate aftermath, Morgan had taken 712 British prisoners and had killed over 100 redcoats, wounding an additional 200 more. Continental and militia forces suffered 25 killed and over 100 wounded. Daniel Morgan may not have his face carved into Mount Rushmore or adorned on a dollar bill. He was aside from a single term in the House of Representatives, apolitical for most of his life. Yet Daniel Morgan was the perfect embodiment of the fiercely individual, doggedly determined, red-blooded colonial American that through unwavering persistence wrested free his own nation from the empire on which the sun never set. The American victory on that cold January morning, deep in the heart of the Carolinas, would set the stage for the final year of battle in the American Revolution. Their stunning defeat at the Battle of Cowpens had left Cornwallis and the British reeling, but it would take the Americans calling upon one of the United Kingdom's oldest foes to finally purge King George's men from their young nation. However, these final campaigns for American independence in 1781 are, for tonight, other stories for other times. September 28, 1781, Yorktown, Virginia. After 6.5 grueling, hard-fought years between the Americans, viewed as either patriots or rebels, depending on which side of the war your perspective granted, and the British Empire, the war was finally, at long last, on the precipice of coming to an emphatic and even more improbable conclusion. An overland march by George Washington had delivered 9,000 men from the northeast to link up with 11,000 French soldiers under the command of Marquis de Lafayette and Comte de Rochambeau. It would give Washington the largest force under his direct command in the totality of this enduring war. As the autumnal sea breeze began to flow through the coastal British entrenchments at Yorktown, General Cornwallis was in the most perilous circumstance he had yet found himself in during the entire conflict. With his back to the sea, and French naval ships creating a blockade to prevent their ability to flee to safety, George Washington had both his men and the French forces positioned for an all-out bombardment of the British after encircling their southern route of escape from the town. Washington would hold the most advantageous position he had throughout the entire war for independence, but the changing weather offered up a stark timeline. The French naval support would be setting sail from Virginia by November to avoid being docked for the winter. The commander-in-chief could not simply starve the British out of the city. He would have to unleash a torrential storm of steel that the British could certainly not hesitate in attempting to return upon the Franco-American forces in kind. George Washington's improbable quest to lead his young nation to independence had been littered with disappointment, defeats, and the blood of tens of thousands of American patriots. Yet, as much to Washington's surprise as anyone, the hand of fate had turned at last in the Continental's favor, and over the course of the next 6 weeks, the destiny of the American nation would finally be decided. Just over 14 months prior, in July of 1780, over 5,500 French troops landed in Newport, Rhode Island. Their intention was to lend support to Washington's men in their quest to dispossess New York City from the British after 4 long years of Crown rule. The British would be outnumbered nearly 2-1. French Admiral de Grasse was taking his fleet to the West Indies, but would then be able to lend his support to the American cause. The crux of the deliberations between the American general and the French High Command centered around the point of attack. Washington felt the best way to defend his beloved Virginia, now overrun with the British, was by delivering a comprehensive campaign upon New York City, forcing Clinton to disregard his southern interests and march his men north to the Empire City in an attempt to repel the Americans. Rochambeau agreed to Washington's plan, but the question of where de Grasse's fleet should be utilized when it arrived from the West Indies would become a point of contention between this new Franco-American coalition. Washington put little faith in French naval efforts when up against His Majesty's Armada, and simply resolved the discussion by stating that they would be used, quote, as circumstances dictate. Rochambeau thought little of Washington's plans for New York, and felt the Chesapeake Bay would be the far more advantageous position for de Grasse's fleet, with the focus on the British fortifications within the Old Dominion. On July 6, 1781, at White Plains, New York, the French and American armies came together, then paraded before the commander-in-chief for his inspection. Washington had maintained that taking New York City remained the primary objective of the joint forces. On August 14th, The decision would, however, essentially be made for Washington when word came from de Grasse that he was heading for the Chesapeake Bay with 29 warships and 3,200 troops. He stated that Washington and Rochambeau, quote, should have everything in the most perfect readiness in the moment of his arrival. Washington had less than a month to march his army over 400 miles south to Virginia, then wait for a fleet of French reinforcements that he was not entirely confident would arrive as promised. On the 19th of August, the march to Yorktown began, and the combined forces headed south in 3 distinct columns, parading through Philadelphia in early September. The Continental Army had not been paid as promised, and they demanded a month's pay in physical coin from the Congress in Baltimore, while threatening to refuse to leave Maryland. Yet they were ultimately obliged. Congress held the expectation that de Grasse was bringing 500,000 silver reals that had been collected from the residents of Spanish-controlled Havana, Cuba, to fund the war and keep the young nation solvent. Washington received word of the arrival of de Grasse off the Virginia Cape on September 5th. The French admiral would send his empty transport ships to deliver the army, along with the arrival of Rochambeau's siege guns. Washington knew the stage would be set for the battle at Yorktown. The native Virginian would take advantage of this southern turn in strategy to return home to Mount Vernon on September 9th. Along with Rochambeau and his aide-de-camp, he would spend 4 days at his estate, after more than 6 long years of being on the campaign for American independence. As they passed through the rural towns of southern Maryland and northern Virginia, the citizens that inhabited them looked on in mesmerized disbelief as the American commander-in-chief unexpectedly appeared before them in the flesh. In late August, General Clinton knew of the French fleet heading toward Virginia and dispatched Admiral Thomas Graves and 19 British warships to head to the Chesapeake Bay to stave off de Grasse's approaching armada. Clinton and Cornwallis would both erroneously believe that Graves' flotilla could halt the advancing French ships. On September 5th, the 2 fleets would meet at the mouth of the Chesapeake, and the British ships, severely crippled by the engagement, would head south, allowing de Grasse to slip into Chesapeake Bay without being detected. Just as the British fleet had made their exit, George Washington came into nearby Williamsburg. Lafayette enthusiastically welcomed the American commander, and the town was lit up with a buzz that walked the line between renewed hope and an anxious curiosity for what this all forebode. Washington now proceeded over the largest force of his military career: 7,800 French soldiers, 3,100 militiamen, along with 8,000 of his own Continentals. Cornwallis, now trapped within Yorktown, had roughly 9,000 men at his disposal, 3,000 of which were German Hessian mercenaries that had played a significant role throughout nearly the entirety of the war. De Grasse held firm on his timeline of leaving the bay by mid-October, after which time British supply ships and reinforcements could be landed in relief of Cornwallis. On the 28th of September, Washington would mobilize his forces, with the French on the left and the Americans on the right, flush against the shoreline in a 6-mile-long arc surrounding the British entrenchment. Cornwallis had 7 redoubts and batteries that were linked with earthworks, as well as a battery of heavy guns. Between the Franco-American lines and the British defenses lay hundreds of yards of open terrain. An overland assault by Washington's infantry would see innumerable of his men cut down as they advanced over this vast landscape. To circumvent this, trenches were dug, in zigzagging fashion, with shelters provided by redoubts within them. At the end of September, Cornwallis received a report that Clinton would be sending reinforcements, and thus Cornwallis withdrew from the exterior works and repositioned his forces deeper within the town in preparation for the arriving friendlies. Graves had sailed back to New York City, yet the promised reinforcements he was to deliver to Yorktown wouldn't hit the open sea until October 19th, far too late to be of use to Cornwallis. On September 30th, a French assault upon the British Fusiliers commenced. A bloody exchange carried on for 2 hours, after which the French were finally driven back, having suffered heavy casualties. By October 1st, the British had slaughtered many of their horses in an attempt to preserve their food rations. On the 2nd, the British opened a vicious cannonade to run as cover for cavalry and infantry who had been sent upon a foraging party. By October 6th, the first parallel trench dug by the Americans to put the coalition forces within musket range of the British was nearly complete. They labored through the night to dig, and over the next 3 days would have all of the gun placements completed. The arsenal boasted 3 32-pounders, 3 18-pounders, 2 8-inch howitzers, and 6 mortars. George Washington's swinging of a pickaxe into the earth, ceremonially if nothing else, marked the start of trenches being dug towards British redoubts 9 and 10, and by the 9th of the month, Franco-American artillery were in these redoubts, and the siege of Yorktown commenced. Washington put a match to the first gun, setting on a cannonade that would commence a blistering round of destruction in this confrontation of heavy guns and iron. Dr. James Thatcher of Massachusetts would recount Washington's start of the battle. Quote, "A furious discharge of cannon and mortars immediately followed. The British returned fire upon the American coalition with a bombardment of their own. The once serene seaside settlement was now consumed with a blistering concert of steel and gunpowder. The French began their assault, driving the HMS Guadalupe across the York River. The Americans then followed suit 2 hours later, once again with Washington firing the first shot. The British defenses were ruthlessly targeted and destroyed. Vast numbers of British desertions occurred. A large house that was assumed to be Cornwallis's headquarters was dialed up and leveled with cannon fire. British ships that attempted to come to the aid of Cornwallis's men were sunk to the tune of more than a dozen, and the rest repulsed. Yorktown was nearly leveled. On the 11th, Washington ordered the digging of a second parallel trench. The British targeted the first parallel trench through the night, but by the next morning, the second parallel trench had become operational. On the 14th, Washington ordered all guns to begin targeting redoubts 9 and 10 that were held by just 70 and 120 British and German soldiers respectively. A diversionary attack was delivered to the north of Yorktown at 6:30 p.m. to give the illusion the town itself was being stormed. Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Hamilton's detachment of 400 light infantry then assaulted redoubt number 10, their bayonets fixed and their muskets unloaded to prevent the sound of troops loading their weapons and thus giving away their position. The Americans slashed away at the abatis, alerting the British to their nearby location and the designs of the attack. The British sentries fired upon the Americans, and the assault upon the fortifications kicked into high gear at once, as the Continentals climbed over the parapets and descended into the redoubt. Fierce and bloody close-quarters combat ensued, and the British were in time overwhelmed by their unrelenting volume of Americans that poured into the confined space. At the same time this was occurring, the French were launching their own raid upon redoubt number 9. The hand-to-hand fighting matching the intensity of the American assault, the French captured the redoubt, placing Cornwallis in an utterly compromising position. The British officer is surrounded on 3 sides by Franco-American artillery. He orders a counterattack out of desperation on October 15th. As Colonel Robert Abercrombie and 350 British troops charged upon the nearest Allied position, Cornwallis had all of his guns fixed upon the single location. The assault was initially successful, with many American and French guns being spiked by the invading force, but the arrival of French reinforcements thrust back the Crown's soldiers. Overnight, the spiked guns had all been restored to working order, and a friendly game commenced between the American and French artillery as they attempted to see which cannonade could inflict the greatest damage upon the beleaguered British lines. Cornwallis attempted to escape across the York River, hoping to break through the American line and head south into Virginia, but a squall hit, making the route untenable. All the while, the relentless shelling never slowed its pace, at times just increasing in scope and intensity as more American guns came online. With all of his last-ditch efforts proving futile, his forces in tatters, and the town he inhabited in complete ruin, Charles Cornwallis made the decision to send a drummer playing Parley upon his percussion, followed by an officer waving a white handkerchief tied to the end of his saber to negotiate his surrender. After 2 days of deliberations, arrangements were set between the two parties in a field just outside Yorktown, Virginia, and it was then made official. The British had capitulated to Washington and the Americans. The British had sought for honorable terms of surrender, but Washington at once denied even the possibility of this, citing British actions throughout the war. American Private Joseph Plum Martin would recount the British surrender. Quote, "Before night we were informed that the British had surrendered, and the siege was ended. The English felt their honor wounded. The Germans did not greatly care whose hands they were in. The British paid the Americans little attention as they passed them, but they eyed the French with considerable malice depicted in their countenances. They marched to the place appointed and stacked their arms. They returned to the town in the same manner they had marched out, except being divested of their arms. After the prisoners were marched off into the country, our army separated, the French remaining where they then were, and the Americans marching for the Hudson. When word arrived to London of Cornwallis's defeat and surrender, the Prime Minister cried out, 'O God, it is all over, it is all over.'" While a euphoric exhale flowed from the American soldiers and citizenry that broke out into nationwide celebrations, Washington fought to temper his joy in the aftermath of his and the young nation's greatest victory. After sending his troops to winter quarters, Washington worked with Congress on further army reforms and the stabilization of the American economy, which subsisted in large part upon French loans. The American Revolutionary War would officially come to a close on September 3, 1783, with the signing of the Treaty of Paris. The disdain of the king's representatives was palpable, as the British officials were unwilling to stay and pose for the painting being made to commemorate the event. The United States had secured their independence in an epic war against the British Empire, but the work of the young state to survive with its original principles was far from over, as were the many battles and wars they would engage in throughout their tumultuous history. But those innumerable tales are, for tonight, other stories for other times. Thank you again for joining us on this episode of History at the OK Corral. Be sure to click the like button, share this episode with a friend, and become a subscriber. Also, if you'd like to support our work and gain early access to episodes as well as ad-free viewing, you can become a member of this channel by clicking on the join button below. And we'll see you next time on History at the OK Corral, home of history's greatest shootouts and showdowns.